Thank you to my channel members and Ko-fi supporters that make these videos possible.
Hello everyone! If you've been playing Commander for any amount of time, you may know that true perfect games, where everyone has a fairly even pace with one another, can be pretty few and far between depending on your meta. Even a game store with the same pool of about 30 or so people can have a decent amount of power diversity. These imbalances can especially be felt if you are on a budget, trying to avoid staples out of a general distaste for them, or trying to make a niche commander or archetype work. These are the decks that need some extra focused care to their construction. This isn't going to be an upgrade video per se, as I feel like not everyone's necessarily looking to make their deck literally stronger, but instead we're going to talk more about removing awkwardness from your deck lists, which we can all agree is no fun, no matter how jank you brew. I would be remiss not to quickly mention that Commander as a multiplayer format is already working in your favor in this endeavor. I made a video covering this topic already, but the gist is that the 4-player nature of Commander makes it so that opponents with particularly strong decks will typically get 3v1 down until they reach parity with the rest of the table again, making clunky decks more likely to win. The operating word here is typically, though, as you can't control your opponents. So this theoretical balancing force doesn't always pan out. And you can certainly have games where multiple opponents come out with strong openers that leave you in the dust. So then, let's talk about what's actually in your power to manipulate. I think the first major oversight people have when it comes to building a commander deck is not taking the time to think about the deck's play patterns. Let's say you want to build Admiral Beckett Brass, who can steal stuff if you hit people with at least 3 pirates. I'll be using her throughout the video as an example. I think it's pretty easy to understand that she can reward a tempo-focused game plan that chips in with evasive pirates. Maybe you even run some other cards that trigger when creatures you control deal combat damage to help supplement the deck if your commander ever gets locked down. If your desired game plan for this deck looks to curve out a lot of little annoying scallywags into the Admiral on turn 4, you wouldn't put Arcane Signet in that deck, would you? Some might be appalled, but she costs 4 mana. You might say, you could cast her turn 3, and do what with her? She's a 4-mana 3/3 on an empty board. To run Arcane Signet here would probably be a mistake, as it betrays Brass's function in this tempo shell as a payoff to early game aggression. As an aside, Arcane Signet could be an alright card choice in some Admiral Beckett Brass decks. It's just that you'd have to stray away from the Turbo Theft plan and move into a more mid-range style of deck, which may be even a stronger build for her. But remember, we're not talking about how to power up commander decks here, we're talking about how to remove clunk from an experience that you want. The lesson to take away from this example is to commit to your themes. Mentioning themes is the perfect segue to get into some discussion about how to explore sub-themes while still being committed to an overarching archetype. It's very easy to see a ton of branching synergy from the main path of your deck, but from that position, it's easy to add cards that lead your deck's consistency astray, which is the bane of being able to keep up with your opponents. Simply put, if you want to explore sub-themes in your deck, you must ensure that there is cohesion between all of the themes present, and that cards that exist to only have synergy with one sub-theme are few to non-existent. My Judith deck is a perfect example of this, as it has a sub-theme of treasure. I've been in board states sometimes where I wish I could conjure Marionette Master into my hand to kill the table, yet I don't run it in the deck, for the simple reason that my deck isn't built to get that board state every game. It's far more built around an aristocrat strategy. The deck does have payoffs for treasure, namely Marionette Apprentice and Mayhem Devil, but the thing to note about these two cards is they work just as well when I'm sacrificing creatures as when I'm sacrificing treasures. Looking at the treasure generators I run in the deck as well, they all happen on a sacrifice or death of creatures, except this one here, Magda the Horde Master, which is for the crime theme. When looking at the crime theme supporters in the deck, you see the same story. Goblin Bombardment, Forsaken Miner, Blood Artist, Vengeful Blood Witch, Immerstorm Predator, Yawgmoth, the commander herself. All of these cards still are incredibly aristocrat-focused, despite supporting the sub-theme the deck has. I think a deck having a sub-theme or two is a great way to not fold to interaction. A backup plan, as it were. I mentioned the example earlier with Beckett Brass running cards like Coastal Piracy to synergize with their evasive pirate tempo plan. Where Brass remains untouched, the extra card draw from these effects is nice, but in the world where you get pinned under a Drannith Magistrate or Brass gets chain removed, these effects are game-winning. Speaking of removal, I hate to say it, but it's true. The best way to better compete with your opponents is to run a solid amount of removal. It's especially good to do so when you're budget brewing. As it turns out, the Great Henge at the end of the day is just another stupid rock that can be abraded like any other artifact. You needn't to betray your deck to do this either. I've always hated the term veggies. to describe card draw and removal spells. You can fold these cards into your deck's play patterns and synergies very easily. Token decks running Convoke spells, self-mill decks running Delve, sacrifice decks running Cathar Commando and other creature-based removal. There are so many options to do things like this. Even cards like actual factual counterspell, the most veggie card in the world, plays nice with something like a Clue deck or Kineso's Priest of Thassa that hold a lot of mana open during opposing turns. The best thing about removal is that you could combat a more staple-laden opponent by matching their power plays, but using removal to pick apart their board works just as well. A greedy enough deck can fold if a value engine is removed, making what looks like a one-for-one exchange actually better than it seems, as it blanks multiple cards on an opponent's board or hand. As a perfect example of this, I will call again on Beckett Brass. The dopey pirates the deck runs aren't much good at all without the captain or an effect that similarly rewards combat damage. Take advantage of the weaknesses like this in your opponent's game plan, and importantly, might I add, try to do so at instant speed, as a coastal piracy that's answered the turn it comes down draws 0 cards, whereas one that is answered at sorcery speed gets the opportunity to replace itself and put you back in the red in terms of card advantage. Removal is the perfect example of a card category that best exemplifies the next concept I want to cover here, the idea of compactness. This is another major way to remove awkwardness from your decks. The gist of compactness is that any given card should serve multiple roles in your deck. Bitter Triumph in a Reanimator deck, for instance, serves double duty as a discard outlet and as a piece of removal. Dissection Tools in my Judith deck makes any 1 damage ping she hurls at a creature enough to kill it, but it also works at sorcery speed as a sacrifice outlet. The more modes a card has, the less often it is dead. Just be wary that you're not losing efficiency by running cards that are too overcosted or cards that make your curve out plan too clunky. The last and probably most major point I must get out there about building a jank brew that can still topple giants is that no matter what you do, please don't run cards that don't do anything. That sounds super obvious, but what do I mean? Well, there's a couple situations I'm referring to. Firstly, and you can trust me, it happens to the best of us, you can get too lost in the sauce. The best example I've seen of this is the card Sun Droplet. Sun Droplet in a Soul Sistery life gain deck where you have like 3 things in play at any given point that each trigger off of life gain can be a fine card. In a proliferation-filled charge counter deck, I would call Sun Droplet though next to worthless. When faced with a card that has a mechanic or what have you that you're building around, ask yourself, if this card didn't mention this on it, but it still functioned the same way, would I be happy with it in the deck? And move from that position. The second situation where you could be accidentally running cards that do nothing in your deck is that they're only good in one stage of the game, but worthless outside of that stage. Try your best to run cards that are good in all stages of the game. Now, this isn't going to be possible for 100% of your deck. Mana Dorks are the perfect example of cards that have an intense enough power level early game that their late game mediocrity is more than justifiable. But in the worlds where you're digging for answers or are in a top deck war, and you hit Phyrexian Arena when that could have been a Night's Whisper to dig just those 2 cards deeper immediately, you can pretty quickly see what I mean here. Your cards should have an impact on the game very soon after they're played. We live in a world of farewells here. The more cards in your deck that you need to untap with for them to be good, the clunkier your deck is going to feel. Don't be afraid to run a slower card as a treat now and there. Hell, run bad cards if you love them enough. Ultimately, what matters most is that you find your deck fun to play. And if cutting a card this video told you to cut would hurt you spiritually to do so, then don't do it. As simple as that. You can fit a couple subpar clunky cards into any commander deck before you start to feel the hurt. Just do so in moderation, and you'll be fine. While all these things are important to making your deck perform better regardless of power, the number one best thing you can do for yourself is to play Magic with your deck. You will be the best judge of what is and isn't working by firsthand experience while piloting the list. I thank you for watching all the way through, and I hope I helped give you some advice that you perhaps didn't think about while struggling with your brew. If you still need some help, come join the Discord link down below. And while you're down there, leave me a comment letting me know what you thought of the video, or if you have experience and or advice concerning identifying and removing awkward cards from decks. Until next time, bye! I mentioned the example earlier with Admiral Beckett Brass, running cards like Coastal Piracy to synergize with their evasive pirate oh my gosh. Coastal Piracy to synergize with their evasive pirate. I mentioned example. Okay. I mentioned the example. I mentioned the example. I mentioned the example earlier with Admiral Beckett Brass running cards like Coastal Piracy to synergize with their. I mentioned the example earlier with Admiral Beckett Brass running cards like Coastal Piracy to synergize with the evasive pirate tempo plan. That sounds awful too. I mentioned the example earlier with Admiral Beckett Brass running cards like Temple Piracy. What?